Hello, 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 listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and today I am finally sitting down with somebody that I've been speaking to on and off for a number of years now. And I'm so pleased to welcome to the podcast Priscilla. Good morning, Priscilla.
Good morning or good afternoon, I guess. Yeah, it's great. It's great to be here. It's been a while in making, so yeah, happy to be here.
It has. And finally, we've both found the time to sit down and have a good talk. But for people that have not seen you on social media, or heard you on other platforms talking about your experiences in controlling environments, can you introduce yourself to the listeners?
So I do a number of things. It's kind of, I guess, a portfolio career. I mean, primarily, I've been doing stuff around neurodivergence inclusion. So I work as, I call it JEDI because it's justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. Nothing to do with Star Wars, but
That's a great
it's
name. You're not going
memorable.
to forget it.
Yeah. So I do facilitation around sort of neurodivergent inclusion in the workplace mostly, and from an intersectional perspective. But I've also talked about cult abuse and how that affects neurodivergent people, multiply marginalized people in particular. And actually, yeah, I spoke at ICSAR about that, the International Cultic Studies Association conference, which is, I think, where we met Kacey, I think, isn't it? Yeah. And I've also I also life model. I also cat sit. I also do a bit of writing and singing and music on the side. I do loads of things. I've got a lot of hobbies and dance and things like that. Yeah.
Woman that is wearing many hats with many outlets, which is what you need in life. Life is so busy all the time, and we need things that we enjoy and things that bring us joy.
Yes, indeed.
So there were a few different things that we could have discussed today, and I know I'm going to have to invite you back onto the show to do at least one more of these recordings so we can talk about the things we won't fit in our conversation today. But we decided that we were going to focus on the Landmark Forum,
Yeah.
which is an organization that you came across during a particularly vulnerable period in your life. And I was wondering if you could describe what initially drew you to their courses and what the Landmark Forum is, because I've never covered them on the podcast. This is the first time for me.
Okay. Yeah. So just to make a distinction, the Landmark Forum is like the first course, and a lot of people think that's the only thing, but actually that's the sort of devious nature of Landmark, is that it's that course and a lot of other courses, that supposedly will transform your life. And so the actual organization is called Landmark Worldwide, but it used to be Landmark Education. And then before that was EST. So it's gone through a lot of rebrands, which is like a lot of cults.
Yeah. Just to kind of describe what Landmark, what the Landmark Forum is, I suppose.
Yeah.
And how you were introduced to that at a vulnerable time in your life.
Yeah. So it's what is called an LGAT. So it's a large group awareness therapy training. They wouldn't say it's therapy at all. They try to make that very clear. It's not therapy. It's sort of legalese in their registration forms. But it is a form of psychological techniques that they use. And the forum itself is like, it's a weekend. So it's like Friday to Sunday, but then you have a Tuesday, what they call a graduation evening, which is where you invite people in your life to share your possibilities, which is basically, in other words, advertise the forum to them and try to make them register. And it's marketed as personal development. And it's very, when you first read about it in the brochure or, whatever sort of marketing material, it's pretty vague. It's basically talking about it being an education, being about transformation, being about creating new possibilities of being that will sort of transform every area of your life in a weekend, supposedly. And that you'll learn all these new concepts about rackets and your past life and how language shapes things and all this kind of stuff. Phenomenological sort of existential sort of bits thrown in as well. So yeah, so it's quite vague when you first look at it about what it's actually about. I mean, obviously, we're going to get into detail more about what it actually happened. But how I got into it was because basically my mom signed me up, and her friend had basically told her that this is something I needed to do because I was really feeling very depressed at the time. So this is 2010, and I was in my early 20s. And it was kind of I guess, a formative time because it's a time when you're sort of expecting to maybe reach some milestones in your life. I think, form a long-term relationship, get into a stable job, sort of you're becoming, really cementing, you're sort of going into adulthood. And at that time, I did not feel like I had accomplished any of that really. And I felt like I was being left behind. I felt like I didn't have any stable work. I felt like a failure really. I was still living with my parents. I didn't really know how I was going to make it because I was trying to be a journalist and it's a very cutthroat industry. And I was doing a lot of intern work for free, and so I just felt at a loss and I just didn't know why I felt like I was unable to do sort of quite basic things, just forgetting my keys all the time or forgetting to do daily tasks and stuff that I was asked to do and just feeling very messy and very unstructured and very chaotic. And, later I was to find out that was because of my neurodivergent challenges, being autistic ADHD. But at the time, I didn't know that. So I was just very depressed. And I think that was like a pivotal reason why, when I really look back at it now, I think, why didn't I just look them up? Why didn't I just go on the internet and be like, Mom, I don't think this is right. I think this is a bit dodgy. But I don't think I even looked it up. I don't even recall looking up. I just remember getting a brochure and be like, okay. And okay, well, Mum's paying for it, so I guess I've got nothing to lose. And that was it really. Like I didn't, and now I think, oh my God, that's crazy. Why didn't I look it up? But I think it was because I was just feeling so depressed that when you're in that vulnerable stage, it's harder to be more critical of things, I think.
It's almost like a desperation to find something that will perhaps answer some of those questions you have on why do I feel disorganized or why do I feel like I'm kind of like stumbling through my day-to-day activities and tasks.
Yeah.
It's interesting that your mum was kind of told that Priscilla has to do this by her friend. So I'm guessing her friend took the forum.
Yes, she did. And this is how Landmark operates, is word of mouth. That's their principal means of marketing. And, like, it's quite clever, really, because you trust the people who are selling this to you, and so you think, well, if my mum thinks it's okay, I mean, I would definitely question it more now, but again, you're in a vulnerable place and someone that you love or is in your life close to you recommends something, you think, okay, well, why not? What's the worst it could do?
Absolutely. Yeah. I can think of many times where somebody has said, and this is kind of not on the same level whatsoever as somebody kind of recommending the Landmark Forum or other large group awareness training programs. But just, when somebody says, oh, you have to listen to this album or you have to watch this film or this TV series, I'm like, now that you've told me I have to, I actually don't feel like I ever will. But then if it's somebody really close to me and they say, oh, it's one of the best things I've ever watched, you have to watch it. I'm like, okay, then I'll give it a go. And it's just weird. It's weird. I'm sure that there's like some psychology behind why that happens. So your mum, she says that she'll pay for you to go to the Landmark Forum for this weekend. How is it when you first arrive? What are your first impressions and where would you find a Landmark Forum weekend located? Are they always in the same types of places?
So I'm not sure if they changed the places up now, but when I was there, it was at the Landmark office headquarters in London. So it was in Euston on Evershot Street, and they have a sort of kind of like a conference type room upstairs on the top floor, where that's where the Landmark Forum is held. They may have the graduation evening somewhere else though. I know they can have had it in like a bigger hotels nearby and stuff like that. But yeah, it's usually, as far as I know, it's usually at the headquarters.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And when you arrived at the headquarters, what were your first thoughts on the building and what you were walking into?
I felt as it was kind of dull, really, quite drab. And I think when I think about it now, that's deliberately so. I don't think they wanted people being distracted by anything extraneous in the environment. So I think it's deliberately pretty drab and, like a typical sort of corporate conference room.
I was thinking very corporate.
Yeah, like a sort of black, all I remember is sort of blackish, well, grayish, dark grayish carpet and white, basically white or off-white walls, a black whiteboard, and then just these plastic chairs like you'd get at school or something, like not very comfortable chairs, all very close together. And then, Landmark, I don't know what they call them, assistants, volunteers, just spread around the room and even at the doors. And they call them door guards, which is, that's very significant to you feeling like you can leave the room. Because, they constantly go on about, well, we're not like Est anymore, because Est was notorious for you're not allowed toilet breaks and you have to sit there for a ridiculous amount of hours and you can't get away at any point. But in this one, it's like, oh yeah, well, you can go for toilet break, but the leader's going to tell you that you shouldn't go away because you might miss something important that you need to get right then. And then there's people at the door. So in itself, that was quite intimidating. And it makes it quite embarrassing to leave because, I mean, I said this in an indoctrination podcast, but because the chairs are so close together, you have to go past a row of people and it's like very like, oh, excuse me, sorry, excuse me. And, it's a very English thing of not wanting to cause fuss or stand out or look like you're being somehow difficult. And I have a distinct impression of thinking, oh, this leader's very American, which sorry to American people out there, but very, the stereotypical vision that people have of like very brash, very loud, again, quite intimidating, very authoritative, like from the get-go. You felt like you had to listen to them and you couldn't disobey them. It was very like, having a sort of a stern headmaster. Your children and you just have to pay attention. But there was also a sense of like, trying to entertain us. There's a whole bit where they recreate going through a typical day, and they do it and like speed it up. And it's meant to be funny. And it was quite funny, to be fair. And I think as soon as you get some people to laugh, I think that disarms you. I think it makes you trust someone more, or like they made me laugh. It's not all, there's something to this. It's not just going to be all dull and, lectures or whatever. There's some, I'm going to be entertained too. That I think that's quite a powerful thing to do to make a whole group of people laugh and to relate to what you're saying. So I think they win you over with that. But I do remember also there was a lot of agreements, what they call agreements, which is, in other words, rules. And I think I remember thinking, wow, like, why is there so many? It was to the point of you can't have painkillers, you can't have coffee. I think there was even a thing like don't read newspapers or like something weird, like information control, right? Don't no psychiatric medication, all of this stuff that you weren't allowed to do. Turn up on time, And also I'm not a morning person. So this started at like 9 a.m., I think it was, which for me is pretty early on a weekend. And so I'm arriving really tired already. And then you're saying I'm not allowed to have caffeine. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? So yeah, that struck me as like, wow, why are there so many of these intimidating list of agreements that you need to stick to in order to be integrity, as they called it, in order to be your word. And yeah.
So already so many things coming through in terms of like psychologically influencing somebody to do what you want them to do by having people dotted around the room and the chairs close together. Plastic chairs as well. Like, is that on purpose? Because they're expensive buildings and they're an expensive part of London, and the Landmark Worldwide as an organization is worth like, a substantial amount of money. So is it on purpose that they put you in like these little plastic chairs that are not comfortable at all?
It's almost like I don't know, like a hierarchy thing, maybe. I don't know, because the leader sits in like, there's like sort of directors' chairs. That's what he sits in. And he's got his like flask of whatever tea or something by him. And meanwhile, we're also not allowed to have any snacks either or bring anything like hot drinks in. So I think there's already sort of a hierarchy created there. Again, it makes me feel like you're a pupil, almost like a child, and there's this headmaster lecturing you and telling you, what's what, and you need to listen to this person because they're the ones in charge and they're the ones that have wisdom, and you don't know what you're doing with your life.
So like an element of infantilizing participants as soon as they walk through the door. And then you're given like all of this stuff with this terminology, lexicon, language that is specific to Landmark Worldwide. So we're already kind of seeing elements of what we recognize to be cult-like methods of control.
Yeah.
So these are your first impressions. You get listed off all of these agreements that you are supposed to stick to. What happens over that weekend? I mean, that's a big question, I imagine.
Yeah. It's to give you the whole podcast. I mean, I tried to summarize, like, and some of it deliberately, like, so it's just a blur. It's just a blur because they deliberately make it like that. So you're trying to remember what actually happened and you're like, oh, what actually did happen? Because they throw so much information at you. It's hard to take all of that in. And then again, you're sitting in uncomfortable chairs and you're thinking, when's the next break? And I need to go to the toilet or I need to eat something. I'm tired, almost falling asleep at some point. And they want you in that state. They want you in that kind of state because then it's like you're more receptive. Either you're more receptive or you're just too tired to even like stop what's going in, even maybe subliminally. You're just in this state where it's like it feels like you can't even put up a fight. You're just being bombarded with all this information and all this lingo about, because they talk about, one of the main things they talk about that I thought was, key to their control is rackets. And that's the idea that you have this complaint about something and they put it like, imagine a laundry and then behind the scenes there's like a gambling operation. And so you may feel like you have a legitimate concern, but what's behind that concern? Is it actually legitimate? What's is it something from your past? Is it, all this stuff? So basically any concern you have can be told, well, that's just a racket. So
that is bizarre because they're kind of telling on themselves when they use that as an example.
Yeah, they are.
Here's this corporate building that looks really bland and boring, and you go in for this weekend, which for some people turns into them, Landmark becomes their entire life and their life is controlled by this organization.
Yeah, the whole thing is a racket.
Yeah, exactly. Like, gosh, Priscilla, that's wild.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? There is a lot of stuff going on like that with Landmark. But yeah, so they bring up all these concepts. A lot of it's about looking at your past life. There's a lot of concentration on family and parents and healing broken relationships with your parents. That's one of the main things they say why we're not a cult, because we bring people together. So there's a lot of concentration on your parents being the source of you. And if that relationship is not good, then you need to heal that. And that's regardless of anything, right? So your dad could be an abuser. He could be a serial abuser. He could be a sexual abuser. He could be a really nasty person. But it doesn't matter, because you have to heal that relationship. And, if they've died, then, they make some people write letters to their dad. And some people read them out and had some really horrible childhoods. And that's part of it, is sharing. That's another part. So people come and share at the microphone, and they talk about some really horrible stuff that's happened in their life. And they get, what they call coaching. And the coaching basically boils down to, it's all your responsibility, whatever happened. So it doesn't matter what happened. Again, it could be sexual abuse, it could be rape, it could be, he had an alcoholic dad or whatever. But it's like, what can you be responsible for? That's what it always comes down to. Because it's like they always talk about being cause in the matter, being responsible for your own life. And they talk about the story you've made up about your life as well. So they talk about people painting themselves as the hero of their own story, but then also the victims. People like to think of themselves as the victims, and victim is just the word that they use. That is just such a derogatory term that you don't want to be called a victim. Like if you have a complaint, oh, you're being a victim again, or having a racket.
Oh.
And then they also use a lot of psychological techniques. One of the main things that I found was the most, I guess, impactful. I think it's on day 2 or maybe day 3, but they have this regression sort of visualization exercise. That's when they talk about, basically they want you to get into the mindset of being like a child at some point that's fearful of everyone, fearful of everything. So they really get you to be in this state of absolute terror. And there are people that I saw that seem so put together and so professional, and then they're just bawling like babies and shouting out stuff about their parents, and I don't know, help me, mommy. I don't know, whatever it was, I can't remember exactly. But it's just stuff that's very, very vulnerable and quite disturbing, really. And you get caught up in it, and then it's like they build you back up, and they have you laughing about everything. They think, oh, isn't it funny that you're scared of everyone? How crazy is that? How funny. So then you're just laughing and go, oh yeah, that is silly that we're so scared of everything. But it has this kind of, it's an emotional roller coaster. The whole weekend is like an emotional roller coaster, and they're breaking you down and then building you back up, and breaking you down and building you back up. And the whole elation of laughing about something after you've just been really in a distressing state means that Amak is almost like, it's like my savior. They've got me out of this state, but they created the state in the first place. So it's like they're building themselves up to sort of put you in they're trying to create you in their image. It's like they're trying to make you see landmark as something that is going to be your salvation. That's what it feels like. And it's not religious, but it can feel like a religious experience. And part of it is also a very abusive way they have of interacting with people. So even on the first day, they're calling you assholes. They're saying, you're assholes, and shouting at you and telling you, you messed up your lives, basically. And that's, again, it's like, I think one Ahad called it sort of tough love, or I don't know, it was like this concept of if you love someone, you also have to be really tough and direct with them. And that for me mirrors abusive relationships.
Yeah.
Because they insult you and say all these things, but then, oh no, but it's all for love. I really love you. At the end, everyone loves each other. It's all good. It's all for your own benefit. So there's a lot of that too.
Whilst also coaching you into understanding your own abusive experiences and finding a way for you to heal from them by basically like forgiving perpetrators on whichever part of the spectrum you find a perpetrator. You know, somebody that calls you an asshole all day every day, and that just grates on you enough to be like uncomfortable, all the way through to people exploiting and harming people in the worst ways imaginable. There's a whole spectrum of perpetrators for different types of abuse and different types of crimes. But they're basically saying from what you've described, like, just forgive those people. And then it's
And
almost
also, it's
like
all your own fault as well, by the way.
yeah, it's all your fault, and you need to forgive these people so that you can heal, so that you can move on. It's like grooming participants to forgive Landmark because
Yeah,
we're about to do these
yeah,
things
and
to you
I
that are
just
going
think
to
the thing
feel
is
really, really.
it's priming people to accept abuse and see it as a form of love and care. And that's what Werner Erhard talks about a lot if you read his interviews, you know.
Right, and he's the guy that started Est.
Yeah. Yeah, Jack Rosenberg is his real name, but yeah.
So he changed his name to sound like,
More
I
like
don't
a
know, like,
German philosopher, basically, is what because he liked Martin Heidegger, people like that. And so I think he wanted to present himself as some sort of intellectual philanthropist. And so, yeah, Werner Ard is the name we chose.
so it gives, it kind of gives Synanon, vibes with the game and attack therapy, and we see a lot of these same types of themes come through in the troubled teen industry, which is something that you mentioned in one of your emails to me. So these two things, they kind of they always collide when they're in conversation in these types of spaces. I think large group awareness training, troubled teen industry, and kind of Synanon as an umbrella that goes over the top.
Yeah.
Is there anything specific from things you've witnessed around the troubled teen industry in documentaries or interviews where you've thought, wow, that is exactly what I experienced?
Well, I know that, I mean, I've listened to some of your podcasts on it, actually. There's really that interview with Michael Balaban was really interesting about CD. And I watched some of the program as well, that documentary. I haven't finished it all, but they did mention there that the program came on the back of this sort of human potential movement and programs springing up out of that, like EST and LifeSpring, and so the LGATs basically. And Synanon was sort of a bit of, like, I guess it came before EST, but there definitely are similarities in all those sort of groups. And the thing that struck me the most was the victim blaming. Because I know that they talk about it in CEDU, it's like, or on the program actually, is that you're responsible for everything. And if you have a complaint, if you're upset, or you're being a victim. So that is a very, very, they pretty much the same sort of an ideology there. And I know that they had things like people sharing personal information. So what I'd call like data mining is like, you're getting people to share very, very personal, vulnerable information that they can then use against you, or they
That
can
is
use
such
it.
a good expression for that tactic. I'm going to pinch that one, Priscilla.
Yeah, no, and it's like they can use it as a carrot or a stick, right? So, they, in the Introduction Leaders program, this later program that I did, which is a lot about, heavily indoctrinating people all the time. It was like, what do you want to get? Their whole thing was, what do you want to get out of doing this? Would you, because there'll be loads of times where you'd be like, why the hell am I doing this? Because there's a lot of hours at Landmark assisting, volunteering. But they'd always be like, oh, what do you want to get out of this? What's your goal? What's your possibility? And Joel, you remember you said that you wanted to get into a long-term relationship. So how are you going to get that if, this is your way of being and this is how you are in life, And so it's a lot of that, using sort of your personal information as collateral almost, or bait to keep you coming. And I think there's similar things that they did in TTI, trouble teenage industry, was like, mining for real personal data that they could use against you.
Yeah. To the
like a failure, or like, you need this program to be a success in life. Yeah.
Also, just with the troubled teen industry, and I'm not sure if this happens in large group awareness training, but sometimes the information that the leaders want is it needs to be severe in nature. So if you were to say like, oh, I smoked a joint one time, you know, I smoked a bit of weed, I smoked a bit of marijuana, if that wasn't seen as severe enough, then you would be kind of held in these sessions and you'd have all of these psychological tactics that are used in like these therapy sessions, attack therapy, you know, withholding your right to call your parents or write home to your caregivers or to have like chocolate or sweets or wear your own clothes or whatever it was. And until you owned up to, you know, like the real information that the leaders would want. And so a lot of the time you hear people making things up to satisfy the kind of wants of the leader, even if that stuff was never true. You know, abuse that they experienced on the severe end of the scale that never happened, but that's what the leaders want to hear, or crimes that they've committed, or drugs that they've tried, and all of these things are really severe and excessive and never actually happened. Do you think that people make things up in landmark sessions to appease the people in the leadership positions?
You know, I have no idea. I mean, it felt like people were sharing what they were sharing was true. But, you know, I guess, I mean, the difference with being in the troubled teen industry is that you're sort of being trapped in the situation which you had no say at all in. And I guess with Landmark, it might be more the case that people are going because they do genuinely have issues that they want to work on, and that's why they're there. And, you know, some of it might be like, well, I came in because I wanted to work on my business, but actually I realized it's all about, you know, repairing my relationship with my dad, because that's how they sort of play it, right?
Yep.
But I do think, honestly, the shares that I heard were people being honest about stuff in their lives. It didn't seem to me that people were making stuff up, but they could have been, for all I know. And there was a lot of pressure to share and to, they called it being in the court, playing in the court, and playing a bigger game. And if you're not sharing, then you're playing small. You know, you're not really participating. You're not really getting the work done, basically, and you're missing out. I honestly think that there are people sharing stuff that I think they'd never told anyone else before. And, you know, you're telling a room full of strangers and a person who has no qualifications in psychology or therapy or anything else.
Yeah, that was about to be my next question.
Yeah.
You raised an amazing point about the troubled teen industry. People are trapped in those programs psychologically and physically, often transported to states on the other side of the country, you know, with no way to contact people that they love or people that they know, and in an area that's like really rural and impossible to escape from. So that's a really, really good point in terms of teasing false information out of people. And you've already said that the sessions are led by coaches. So you kind of do this, or you're coached in these moments where you share something. And I was going to say, does that mean that, you know, does the coaching come with anyone that has qualifications or experience? And are you told like, well, this is going to be led by somebody that's like got experience doing this and this and this, like with psychology or sociology?
No.
Yeah, because in the troubled
yeah.
teen industry, all of the predominantly the therapy that takes place is usually with somebody that does not have qualifications in being a clinician of any kind.
No, I mean, I think there's some exceptions. I think there were some, well, actually, no. I don't even know if that was in Landmark. I think it was in Lifespring. I remember listening to a good cult, and there was one guy who had some concerns because he had done psychology. So I think that would be a massive thing, is that I don't think they'd want people to have other disciplines, because the leaders themselves need to be indoctrinated into this program and believing that this is something that is beneficial or whatever they think. It's hard to know what they think, but you know, if you have another discipline, if you're actually a psychologist or a therapist or whatever, then you could be going, well, this is a red flag, this is a red flag, this is coercive control, this is not great. So, you know, I think it's advantageous advantageous for them to have someone who's just purely trained in landmark, basically, that they can build up in their image. And that was the thing about me going to the program, is I'd never done any sort of self-help or anything like that before, or knew any of these psychological techniques, so I couldn't recognize what was happening.
Just
So yeah, I think that's a important point for them, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds what you said there about, having people in leadership positions that have been indoctrinated by the landmark process themselves. It's such an insidious thing, and the potential to harm or reharm people in these moments where they're sharing these really vulnerable stories without having, like professional help or signposting people to places they can go when they've left landmark, and they're kind of just like maybe talked about something extremely traumatic from their past that they've unearthed maybe in this landmark session. It's a really scary thought to then just send people out into the world after this traumatic experience, because it's traumatic itself. It sounds like just watching people talk about their experiences sounds a bit traumatic in itself.
And I think at first it was quite hard to take this sort of tough love, direct approach they had, because you were listening to people sort of almost sobbing their heart out. And then that was the other thing, was that, don't pity them, or don't shut off your normal response to someone crying. Because if you try to kind of come up there and comfort them, then you're just encouraging them in their story. You're just encouraging them in being a victim. So it's like, even to that extent, you'd have people, I remember someone getting upset and me thinking, my normal response, "Are you okay?" And she's like, "Oh, don't basically her response is kind of like, "Don't encourage me," or, "I'll get over it," or "It's just a story," or, whatever it was. But so it's like she'd been trained to say, "Don't comfort me." And I just remember that very distinctly and thinking, okay. But I don't know, I didn't really properly question it, but it's one of the things that registered in my mind as being like, so we're not even allowed to comfort people when they're in distress. That's that's the whole thing.
Well, that's so uncomfortable in my body to think about people maybe for the first time talking about experiences they've had that they've never shared with anyone because of fear or stigma, or, especially when you're talking about some types of abuse that people experience throughout their lives. People keep it to themselves a lot of the time, and they don't tell anybody because they feel like maybe it is their fault, or they feel like if they talk about it, no one's going to believe them or help them or support them, or maybe they'll side with the person that harmed them. And that's exactly all of the things that are happening when they stand up in front of that room of people and tell these strangers about those experiences. That's a really hard thing to imagine, just kind of participating in and witnessing as well. It's not nice. It's not nice to think about. And you said that the sessions are long and they're intense. Alongside these psychological techniques that are used, what effect did this first weekend have on your kind of mental and emotional health at the time?
So I think, it's kind of hard to say, but I feel like I was just tired the whole time. I felt, it was very much, like I said, it was a very much an emotional roller coaster. And, I think I had some conversations with my parents that I think I wouldn't have had before. But it's like, again, it's like, oh, if it wasn't for Landmark, I wouldn't have done this. So it's like attributing everything to Landmark. And there's an intense sort of, I guess it might be trauma bonding with the leader and then bonding with the group, because of these, intense experiences and what they're sharing. And so there's this sense that, maybe this is not really answering your question. So, but there's a sense that it's like you're sort of in it together. And I think maybe I got some sort of, I don't know, comfort from that, because I feel like I wanted to be part of a group. I wanted to feel accepted. And I felt like I'm quite an intense person anyway, and I probably overshare anyway. So I think I was probably right for something like this, because I'm someone that probably tells too much about myself to someone I've just met anyway. So it's hard to feel like, oh yeah, this had a negative impact on my mental health at the time, because at the time I think I felt like, oh, this is just amazingly sort of intense experience, a unique experience, and I'm bonded with all these people, and I felt like it was something that was good for me, right? But if I look back on it in hindsight, I think that could have had a much more, I mean, I feel quite lucky. I feel like I could have had a much more negative response to all of that.
Hmm.
And in the end, I did, but it was kind of being ground down over time rather than, I know some people get psychosis, some people end up in, sectioned, some people kill themselves, unalive themselves. So I feel quite lucky in that respect that it didn't trigger me to do that. But I feel like, maybe it could have done. It maybe if I didn't have, the right support networks in place, if I didn't have supportive parents or something else had happened, who knows? I don't know. But yeah, it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous what they're doing. And I have no doubt about that. I feel like people say, oh, the forum isn't as bad. It's when you get later on that it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous from the beginning. I really do.
Hmm.
And from the danger for me is that I got enmeshed in the group, and I felt like I had to continue. Because I had to continue this feeling of elation that they give you at the end of going through all of that intense stuff. And so it's like you become codependent on this group and these programs in order to like structure your life and give myself this sense of purpose, and like I'm getting somewhere. I'm not just going back to feeling depressed or feeling like I'm not getting anywhere, or me feeling like, that's the fear that they instill in you. If you leave, then you'll just go back to your sort of small, mediocre life. And so I think that's the danger for me is, yeah, getting so married to this idea that Landmark was the only thing that could help me.
Right.
And they talk a lot about not doing, don't bother doing therapy because it's much cheaper just to do Landmark. So yeah, that's quite
That
telling.
ties in a lot with the work that John Hunter did with his research. And I know we spoke a little bit about
Yeah.
John's work over email as well, where he described in his research that you would go through this really painful, really emotional, really uncomfortable and exhausting weekend. And then at the end of it, you have this graduation ceremony where you're celebrated and you're told that you've achieved something significant. And that feeling of elation that you've described that you get, it becomes like how people describe first taking a type of like illicit drug for the first time. It makes you feel a certain way, and you think that your life has changed forever, but then after time that feeling wanes and it goes away. And when you can't get that back, or when you are somebody that has kind of perhaps underlying or not underlying mental health issues, it's kind of laid out really well in John's research, and the way you've just described it there, how people do become suicidal, how people do attempt to take their own lives, and the exacerbation of ill mental health symptoms as well. So all of these things are things documented in John Hunter's research, which is available online to read.
Yeah, I've
Maybe I'll
read some of
put a
it.
link to it in the episode description as well, in case anybody would want to read
Yeah.
that. But you've mentioned there that you had this experience, you had this elation, you came out the other side, and before those feelings had a chance to kind of simmer down and disappear, you decided that you were going to carry on with Landmark so that you could retain that feeling
Keep this
of,
thing going. Yeah, yeah. And I think what is significant here is to talk about, being neurodivergent as well.
yes,
And with, for example, with ADHD, you naturally have low dopamine levels. So anything that is going to elevate those dopamine levels, you're going to be like, I want that, I want that. I need to keep this going, because you're so naturally low in dopamine anyway. And that's what ADHD medication does. It heightens your dopamine levels, right? which, you know, it would be very significant if I had actually known I was had ADHD then, and they told me I couldn't take my ADHD medication. You know, that would be very significant in the effect it would have on me as well. So yeah, it is like it's an addictive behavior, and a lot of ADHD people are addicts. And that's why I noted that, you know, I think a lot of people who do these kind of things, these come into these cults, are a lot of neurodivergent people, because they crave that sort of intense experience, that sense of sort of elation and euphoria. Yeah, I think it's a very big thing. And it's definitely very effective. And the fact that they leave you with that sense of a high, and then they come in and say, okay, so the next course, the next course is the advanced course. And if you want to keep going, and if you want to play a bigger game, you know, who's with me? And it's almost like group pressure, and like everyone put your hand up if you're doing it, you know, and you want to be part of the group, you want to join in, and you want to be part of that feeling of like, oh, this is exciting, you know, this is going to keep this going, or I can be with the same people. And so they're very clever in the way they hit you with the next course, just as you're in that sort of high elated state of being, which I think is quite common for cults.
Do you remember roughly the price of how much each of these courses or experiences would cost?
So at the time, so this is 2010, so it would have gone up since then, but I think, so I think the first course was like the cheaper course. It was like, I think it was like, it could have been like 350. It could have been, I can't remember exactly. My mum paid for it, but it was around maybe £300, something like that. And then the next course was a jump up, because that was about £500 or something like that. Yeah. I don't know if I even paid. I was trying to think. I'm not sure if I even paid for that one. I feel like, oh, it might be the next course, but I remember like having a conversation with someone and being like, oh, I can't afford this, and then they paid for me, basically. So I can't remember if that was the advanced course or the next one, but it was definitely one of the courses. Yeah, people were just so like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do this. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think it's funny because the introduction leaders program is probably one of the cheapest ones. It's like 6 months, and you pay, at the time, I think you paid like £150. But the big massive caveat is that you're doing a lot of work for them for free. You know, this is a for-profit organization, remember? So you're basically doing telemarketing for them to try and register people into the forum. So it's like, oh, it's so cheap, and it's 6 months, and you're going to learn how to be a leader. It's like, no, you're paying to work for them for free. That's what you're doing, effectively.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then we go, oh, it's so cheap, you know? And look at, they always be like, oh, look at Tony Robbins courses. They cost thousands of pounds. They'd always be comparing it like that. You know, we have scholarships for firemen and nurses or whatever. And so, yeah.
Comparing their prices to Tony Robbins' prices would not be a compliment or a good idea in some spaces, because I know that there are talks about him himself perhaps being a problematic figure in the world of self-improvement.
Yeah, he.
I'll leave that one up to the listeners to decide if they are familiar with who that person is, until we have a guest come on and maybe speak about him. Who knows? Maybe one day. When did your perspective on Landmark start to shift? When did you decide that you needed to stop carrying on with the courses and the training and actually step away from Landmark altogether?
So I don't think it was like a very conscious decision. I think it was a gradually over time, and especially during the introduction leaders program, the ILP, because I did that twice. For my sins, and you know, there was a moment on the ILP which I've talked about before, which is when I called someone. So you know, so we have this list of people to call, and a lot of the time people are also on do not call lists, and we're still calling them because we're still being given these lists of people to call. So that in itself is probably some sort of data breach. It had like names and addresses of people lying around. But anyway, so I called this woman about I think coming to either registering to program or coming to a information evening. I can't remember. But she told me that her partner had killed themselves after they did the forum. So I got that information, and all I said was sorry. I didn't really know what to say. I was really struck by the fact that she wasn't even angry. I would have been furious. I would have been like, "Don't speak to me. Who the hell do you think you're?" Like, I would have been so furious. But she was just so calmly saying this information to me, and that, I think that really struck me, and it really left an imprint on me. And I just remember that afterwards, the coaching I got, and the coach looked bewildered too, because you always have to do a debrief after you've done your session or whatever, and talk about how many people you call, what didn't go right, basically, or what you could have done better, or blah, 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 blah. And all she said after that, what I told her about the suicide was, all you could say was sorry. And she looked kind of bewildered herself, like she didn't know what to do. And that's it. So I got this really traumatic information. And, I said this before, and I think Indoctrination or another podcast, that it's like, there's no aftercare. There's no someone speaking to you and say, look, I'm sorry, that must have been really upsetting to hear that. No, it's just, oh, well, all you could say was sorry. That's it. So that kind of went into my brain as being like, okay, something's not right here. And also because they have all this legal waivers and their registration forms about, you shouldn't be on any antidepressants. You should check with a doctor if this is okay for you, and all this about like mental health and stuff. But I know for a fact that there were so many people in this program with mental health issues talking about having wanted to kill themselves. I myself, when I went into program, had suicidal thoughts. I was really depressed, and I just think the screening was just nothing. It was just like going through quickly this list of legal waivers just to cover themselves.
Yeah.
And that was it. And
lot of care for participants at all.
I don't think they really cared if they were actually had mental issues. It's just like, we need to just cover ourselves and say, look, we did say this may not be suitable for you, so you should have read the form or whatever. So I think it was those kind of things. I think I was getting sick of talking to people about doing the forum, because it became a thing where I felt like I was sort of, again, this sort of religious fervor of feeling like you're almost like in Jehovah's Witness, and you're trying to save people's souls, and like you have to talk to everyone. It's like you become so manipulative in your head because you're trying to think of reasons to talk, like have the person speak about something that's important to them, and like go through all these steps, and then, okay, well, have you thought about this? Like, the Landmark Forum helped me with this, and maybe it could help you with that. And this is people you may have just met that I was thinking about this. How can I talk about the forum to them? That's how bad it got, in terms of feeling like, because they always drill it into you. If it's something you gain from, why wouldn't you share it with people you love or people you care about as well? And you're being selfish if you're not sharing this work with people. And so there was just such a high level, and it got worse and worse as you did more program about the number of people to speak to, and bringing people to your graduation evening, and making sure you're sharing what you got. And it became intense. And people, I think I lost friends over it, because they were just sick of me talking about it. And I'd be
right.
going, you're going to talk to me about Landmark again, aren't you? I'll be running out of people to call. And I felt like I was in a prison. I felt like trapped. And I don't like talking to people on the phone anyway, at the best of times, unless it's someone I really am close to. So it was really difficult. And just making those agreements that it's like long hours, it's like, 4 hours or something. And then if you were there in the evening, you might be there till like midnight or something. And then doing extra volunteering, assisting on top of that, always being called about, can you insist here? Can you? So you're spending so much of your time at Landmark, so much. And then I think I just was exhausted. And I think that was it, really. Like, it wasn't like a concrete, I must leave. It was like, I just physically can't do this anymore.
So it becomes your whole life
Yeah.
and your whole personality too. People see you and they start associating you as the person that always talks about Landmark.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I felt like I just, because it exploits people's passion and people's idealism, and so I felt like I didn't have any boundaries, and they're always encouraging you not to have boundaries. So they talk about being unstoppable in the face of no agreements. That's one of the things in the Introduction Leaders program. And being unreasonable and making things happen that you think, wouldn't happen. And all of this stuff, right? And this is all just encouraging you to have no boundaries with people. They haven't agreed. Well, be unstoppable, be unreasonable. They don't want to do it. Be unreasonable, you know? And
Make
so,
it sound like they're empowering you using that type of language when actually they're just kind of encouraging you to be really insufferable to people that are like,
yeah,
I'm not interested.
yeah. And it's like, it's all done in the face of, this is your empowerment. This is your training, right? To involve people and to have you be some inspiring person that can persuade people to do stuff. And, like, you need to have other people do stuff because all your possibility is created by the agreement of other people. So if you don't have other people doing it, that possibility will die. And so there's all this sort of, pressure and like bait and the way, I guess it's like kind of bait and switch and all these techniques they use to convince you that you need to do this for your life. And if you care about other people and if you want a world that works, that's what they talk about, a world that works. Yeah. So it was so intense, that pressure. And it just became way too much.
So really, Landmark Worldwide as an organization are very good at being vague, at holding back details, at telling you one thing and then actually it's another thing that's happening.
Mm.
So not just bait and switch, but also a lot of just lack of details really on what you can expect from your experiences with Landmark. And you've mentioned that it's going to impact people with neurodivergent diagnoses differently. How long was it before you started to realize that Landmark could be a cult? And then how long was it after that that you started to think about how that would affect you and others differently if you did have a diagnosis around neurodivergency?
So the second part of saying, when did you notice that having a diagnosis would make a difference?
Yeah, so maybe we should start off by first saying, how long was it before you started to think about Landmark as maybe being a cult, and what made you realize that they had cult-like elements?
So it was really during lockdown. I mean, first of all, I listened to this podcast about another cult, I was in One Taste. And then that's when I started exploring. I went on to, one of the things also they tell you and at the start or near the start is don't listen to this guy, Rick Ross. He didn't do the program. We invited him on. He didn't want to come and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And they talk about the internet being like full of porn and whatever. And don't believe what you read on the internet. Right. So, it was one of the first sites I went to was the cult, what's it called? The cult forum, the cult education forum. And on there, they had like loads of testimonies from people from Landmark. And so I remember just staying up till really late at night reading these testimonies. And suddenly it sort of all made sense. And all the techniques, all the contradictions, because there's so many internal contradictions on what they're telling you about, and confusion, and if you're confused, just get more coaching. But there was someone, there's like a user called Nettie on this, who laid out all of the techniques, and it was so clear to me. Like they were talking about how, because they have this whole thing about they say being your word, being integrity, and they obviously redefine integrity as to mean following landmarks agreements and not being compliant to landmark. That's what integrity means really for them. But if you go out of integrity, don't make yourself bad and wrong. It's just, it's fine. Just you need to restore your integrity, blah, 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 blah. But, because they have such an emphasis on being your words, you do make yourself bad and wrong. So then you're making yourself bad and wrong going, oh no, but I'm then not following the thing of like, don't make yourself bad and wrong. So it's all just a sort of mind game, really. And you just get more and more confused. And then you think, oh, am I following this right? And then it's like, get more coaching, get more confused. And then I think, oh, I must be not getting something or I need to do more work here. So like, that was sort of broken down for me in these like sort of testimonials. And I just realized all of these sort of doubts I've been having, even just people having like standing up for themselves and not following the program and being made an example of and them just having to come under this, like people the leaders undermining them because they were being basically non-compliant. And that stuck out to me as well. And like you couldn't disagree with the leaders. Basically, it's like, oh, you're meant to be like I talked about my possibility being full self-expression, right? But don't criticize the leaders. Don't do that, because then you'll stand out, and then you'll be made an example of, and then you'll be humiliated.
You have no limits, but there are limits.
Yeah,
there
are limits.
But actually, we will stop you if you start to go too far in the wrong direction. Gosh, and there's so much more we haven't had a chance to talk about today. But I really wanted to end our conversation on just bringing some more awareness to the listeners, or validation perhaps to the listeners as well, who may be wondering why they've experienced things in a certain way. So a lot of your advocacy work now is around highlighting how to create support for people that are neurodivergent and recovering from a cultic experience, because it's not necessarily going to be the same for people that are neurodivergent accessing things like a trauma-informed therapy and things like that. So I just wondered if you could talk us through how you kind of started to think about cult recovery that way, and if there are any specific resources you can think of that people can access at the moment. Because it's very niche. I feel like cult recovery is niche anyway.
Yeah.
And then when you're thinking about different demographics of people, it makes it nicher still.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason why, like one of the main reasons why I did that XR talk and why I started speaking about my experiences was because I noticed a total lack of understanding or acknowledgement of neurodivergence. And the emphasis has been on, cult survivors being normal, quote unquote, normal people. And I didn't really relate to this idea of normality. And what does normal mean anyway? And when you break it down, a lot of the time you're thinking white, middle class, white collar professional, that kind of thing. That's normal. And, like straight, heteronormative. And the examples they'd always give is like, oh, which I was reading in a lot of these comedy books is like, we're entrepreneurs, we're lawyers, we're doctors, we're blah, 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 we're intelligent people. And I understand why there was a need to do that, because, it's the stereotype of calling people these crazy people. Why would they join a cult? So I do understand it on that basis, but then you're going so far the other way to sort of appease this narrative that you're then sort of leaving out any nuance and understanding of how you could be vulnerable to cults, because it's like these cults are it's like framing the cults as these all-powerful entities that have completely manipulated you, without then looking at, okay, but why would you be more susceptible to be being manipulated than someone else? Because, I talked to loads of people about Landmark and I didn't sign many people up, right? I'm glad I didn't, really glad I didn't. But there's a reason why some people go for it and some people won't, I think, and that could be because you're at a vulnerable time in your life. But if you have the added neurodivergence, or you're multiply marginalized in some way, then you're already going to be primed to feeling like society doesn't care about you. There's nowhere to turn. Institutions are letting you down, or normal institutions. So why not go for some alternative that could help you? You're more likely to feel like outcast from society. And especially being neurodivergent, I have a strong sense of social justice, a strong sense of, wanting the world to be a better place. And they really exploit that. So I didn't really, sorry if it's not answering your question, but I didn't really see that in a lot of talked about. They talk a lot about people being idealistic, and wanting to make a difference, but they don't then connect that to, well, this is a very strong trait of being neurodivergent, is to have that idealism and to have that sort of vulnerability to sort of taking people at their word as well, and thinking that there's not these malicious, devious people, that what they're saying is true, or why would they want to manipulate someone? I really didn't see many resources about this. There's a few, I think, more podcast interviews coming out that I heard. I think there's one indoctrination about someone with OCD being on Alcoholics Anonymous. And there was one, I can't remember the name. Send you the links afterwards. But there's a few podcasts, but nothing really in sort of the mainstream literature or resources. Right. So that's why I started to speak out, and I am with my friends putting together a project which we're calling Culture and Liberation, and in which we really want to talk about these things. We really want to talk about, being multiply marginalized, and how that does affect things, and how when you come out of a cult, it's not exactly life is great again. All is well, because you're still dealing with sort of the smaller cult of, capitalist society. You're still dealing with discrimination. You're still dealing with the trauma of living in a world that isn't built for you. That is gonna affect you on a daily basis. And how cults actually connect to that. They take stuff from wider society and turn it up to its extremes. And I see Landmark basically as a reflection of sort of very neoliberal capitalistic values.
Yeah.
It's not just a fringe thing that comes from nowhere. It comes from values that are already in society. Otherwise it wouldn't work.
Yeah, it's like a micro culture of coercive and controlling behavior that is propagated by an existing macro structure.
Yeah,
like, the way the country is run, or the way that capitalism works throughout the world. That system and those ideals propagate those microcosm cultures that just are cults, that are harmful, that are exploitative, and that flourish because the larger systems at work in our world encourage those ideals and practices. And then they all get to talk about how much money they make off the backs of systemic exploitation. And so it goes round and round and round. And I talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
And there's so much stuff to talk about with yourself, Priscilla. There's other cultic groups that we could be talking about that I will have to invite you back on to discuss. But before we wrap up for our session today, I wanted to ask you if there were any final comments or pieces of advice that you would like to give to listeners who themselves may have come out of troubled teen programs or large group awareness trainings, or are in cult recovery as a person that is neurodivergent.
So I guess the first thing is, just be careful about who you idolize and put on a pedestal. Because, when I think about, like, one thing I didn't go into that much, but looking into Werner Erhard and Jack, aka Jack Rosenberg, and his life, and realizing how abusive he was, how misogynistic he was, how he would tell Holocaust survivors that they caused their own Holocaust, basically. How he basically got someone to strangle his wife. And then Landmark is all about, oh, we're bringing people together and blah, blah, blah. And when you realize, oh my God, I've just downloaded this bigoted assholes, basically, with ideology into my brain, it's infuriating. And so I think it's my advice is, just to be careful about if people start talking about someone as if they're just this like God or whatever, and they could do no wrong, then be suspicious. And there's no one right way of doing things. And I just think that any group that tells you that is, that's already an issue. If they say that this is the only way to do things, it's the only thing that's going to get results. But as to your point about people coming out of it and advice, I think it's hard because I feel like the cult recovery community or the anti-cult community, there's still so far to go in terms of accommodating and understanding neurodivergent survivors. And so I'd like to say join these sort of cult recovery groups or get involved in that community, but I'd also say be wary too, because it they're not always going to understand your experience or invite it even. And I've heard some stuff around Black Lives Matter being a cult or wokeism being a cult, trans people being a cult. And so I think it's just having that reflective, critical mindset because you can go out of one group and go into another group and then be re-traumatized and that's not to say that everyone's bad or not at all, but it's just I think any group now I've got a sort of critical mind about, because I need it's protecting yourself really and asking yourself, am I really welcome here, or is all of me really welcome? Like if I start to talk about racism, if I start to talk about neurodivergence, are people going to try and shut me down or tell me that's not important? And so it's being aware of that and being aware that not all communities are going to readily accept you or what you have to say. But taking what you can that is useful, there's a lot that I took from, for example, Yanni Alalek's book, and there's still stuff out there. Like I was on a Deeper Impulse podcast with Candy Shooter, and she's doing a lot of great stuff in terms of understanding the intersectionality of it. And so there are people out there. Let's talk about sex, sex, and and the work you're doing yourself, Kacey, and it's finding those people that you connect to and talking about the stuff that you can relate to, and that is really needs to be talked about. And that's what I'm trying to do with my project, and I'm hoping it'll be out by the end of this year, starting with an Instagram account and hopefully turning into a book of people's experiences, because I think it's high time that we've had more diverse perspectives on this experience.
Yeah I mean, just to read that type of stuff I imagine it's validating for readers that connect with the writing, but it's educational for people like myself who are trying to understand as many of the different moving pieces as possible. So there's many different reasons to have that type of literature out in the world. And I hope at some point I can give the listeners an update on where they can perhaps access some of that material you're putting together, or maybe even purchase a book. I would love to be able to go back to the listeners and say, we've got Priscilla on again. She's here to talk about her book.
Yeah.
That would be so good.
Yeah, I really hope so, because it's what I wanted. It's like what I wanted to see when I was looking for stuff to read and just not reading it. And instead reading stuff like, there's hardly any disabled people in cults. And like, really? They're just all normal people. Nothing to see here, So I think it's really important to understand those vulnerabilities, because it's making yourself safe as well. It's part of that education around, okay, and it's not even to say being neurodivergent is something, curse or something. It's just recognizing, these are my vulnerabilities. Yeah, sometimes I can be a bit gullible, and sometimes, I can be taken in by stuff, and that's okay. It's just recognizing that. It's not a shameful thing. It's just understanding what are the things to watch out for and what are the techniques people use that you could be susceptible to. And I think, so many people deserve to understand these things to not get in the situation in the first place.
And I imagine the recovery pathways might look slightly different as well. So there's always that to consider, the way that the people approach recovery. I mean, there's not a lot out there for recovery at all for anybody when it comes to cultic abuse or even coercive and controlling behavior. But it's on the rise. So to be able to throw another book in the mix that speaks specifically, I think that would be a priceless book.
It's got to happen. So
yes, do keep us posted. Do keep us updated. Hopefully we can invite you back on to come and talk to us about One Taste, because that is a whole other subject. Although I'm sure there are many overlapping themes that come out between Landmark and One Taste, even though on the surface they're two very different types of organizations or groups. So thank you so much, Priscilla, for your time today and for talking us through a brand new thing that I've never spoken about on the show. I'm so glad that we finally got the chance to sit down and chat to each other.
Yeah, no, me too. It's been really great.
We'll invite you back on and hopefully we'll see Priscilla soon. But until then, take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.